Hello everyone and welcome back. Once again, I am your instructor Vernon Creviston, and today we'll be kind of picking up where we left off in our last lecture, uh, talking about the English colony of Jamestown, or the Virginia colony as it's officially known. Now, last time when we left off, we were talking about a colony on its way to disaster. Just like the first English attempt at colonizing at Roanoke, things were not going well at Jamestown. And we're going to kind of explain how they turn things around, what turns things around, and what happens as this colony establishes itself, and the impact that'll have kind of on the English in general, right? Especially on their empire building. And what we're going to start with is this picture here on our title slide. It does kind of lay out some of the things that are happening here, and it does tell us a little bit about what these English colonies are going to be like. In this picture, you see those English settlers, those first 100 from Jamestown, and then the several hundred thousands more that follow after that. Here they interact with the natives, sometimes negotiating with them. Here, like in the middle, where these English are trying to work out deals for land and food. In the background, we see the native villages in the area. So the English know this is somebody else's land, but they're going to come and try and take it anyways. Here they're going to organize, work together with the natives. Over here, it's fight the natives and push them out. And one of the things we're going to notice here is that the English are going to be a little different than everybody else. Yes, they're going to have contact with the natives like the Dutch, the French, and the Spanish. Yes, they're going to have wars with the natives like the Dutch and the Spanish. But they are not going to do what the Dutch, the Spanish, and the French do, and that is really interact much in a single community with the natives. For the English, it's always going to be this is ours and that's yours. And then when the English want that, they're going to take that and force the natives out again. The English are never going to do what the Spanish do and come in and say, okay, all of you people are us now. They're always going to see natives as distinctly different and separate outsiders. Something that's actually kind of conveyed through even to this day. Natives are put on reservations, are separated out from the rest of American society. They've never really been incorporated into the American political body, if you will. And that origin, that way of looking at natives actually starts from the very beginning, from Jamestown in the Virginia colony. So again, first matters. We're going to look at just how powerful being first is, how it kind of sets the tone, sets the template that others are going to follow along. And we're going to look at the establishment of this Virginia colony, and through it, what's going to happen around it. Because Virginia is not going to be the only English settlement in this area. There's going to be Maryland, and then the Carolinas, and eventually Georgia. So the English are going to come and keep coming and start spreading out. And we have to figure out how they do it and why they're successful this time when they weren't the first time. So a couple other things to kind of keep in mind. Again, Europeans are coming over in a big way to the Western Hemisphere. You have the French that have claimed most of the interior of North America. You have the Spanish that control virtually all of Central America and almost all of South America and a good chunk of North America. What isn't taken over by France or Spain is now being competed over with Russia, the Dutch, the English, the Swedes. And remember, like with the Swedes, none of this stuff is guaranteed for success. The English colony of Roanoke literally wiped out. The Swedish colony of Fort Christina taken over by the Dutch. These are pretty tricky things that the Europeans are doing. You are not guaranteed success in any way, shape, or form. And of course, as they fight over smaller and smaller territory, there's going to be a lot more competition, a lot more rivalry, a lot more competing claims for these territories. So a lot going on here. And if you're the Europeans, you look at the natives as either a potential ally like the French or somebody that needs to be moved out of the way like the English and sometimes the Dutch do. So you've got to deal with that issue as well. If you're the natives, you've got to figure out how can you use these new people who don't seem to be leaving anytime soon to your advantage. So that's where we're going to kind of pick it up, right? So remember last time we talked about this guy, John Smith, this kind of a prototype of American success story before there's even an America. This guy that's a soldier and adventurer who comes to Jamestown and actually helps keep it alive its first year, year and a half that he's there. He's the one that goes and negotiates with the natives for food and resources. He's the one that kind of keeps tempers, keeps the relations cordial between the two sides. They may not be friends, they may not, they're definitely not allies, but they actually can coexist, right? Smith is able to kind of work out this idea that the English are going to live there in this small area called Jamestown and a little bit of land around it. And the natives are okay with it as long as they're getting something out of it, namely weapons, right? Namely metal items that they could really use in trade with other native tribes. So that works as long as Smith is there. But when Smith leaves, things start falling apart. Once again, as I mentioned last time, things get so desperate at one point called the starving time that a lot of English colonists have to resort to cannibalism. They have to eat their dead, so to speak. So they're not killing each other to eat each other, but when you die, they may cut off portions of you to have meat to keep you those that are alive continuing to live. So things get pretty awful there in Jamestown by the 1610, 1611. So that begs us the question, why would anybody go there? Remember last time I was showing you reports about how even the people in Jamestown were writing back saying, hey, all we're doing is dying here. We're not finding any gold, but we are finding a lot of death. 70, 80% of the people there in Jamestown are going to die from disease, from dysentery, cholera, typhoid, all kinds of these awful diseases that Europeans have brought with them. They kill Europeans just like they kill Native Americans. So this begs us the question, what's going to get you to go here to this colony, right? Why would you even want to go to Jamestown? Because after all, in his first 15 years or so, the Virginia company that runs this colony is going to be able to entice 10,000 people to go to this colony, where 8,000, 80% of them are going to die within the first 9 months they're there. So what's going to make you take this chance? You have an 80% chance of dying doing this. Who in their right mind would take those odds? Well, surprisingly, at least 10,000 people, right? Which tells us something. Things are hard in England right now. This is before the Industrial Revolution. It's after a period called enclosure, when rich nobles take over land and say, this is ours and you can't farm it unless you pay us. And if you're a poor English farmer, you may not be able to pay the English lord their rent. So what do? You can't farm anymore. You don't have any land. Well, you go wandering around, living in towns, hoping that people will feed you. So things are kind of desperate in England. It's not like that for everybody, but there is a large part of the population back home in England that do say, well, things are bad here, maybe it'll be better for me there. Because human nature always says it's the other guy that gets sick. It's the other guy that's the statistic, not me. So in the end, the Virginia Company is able to find people, but it comes at a cost. The Virginia Company has to institute a thing called the headright system. At first, the Virginia Company controls everything about this colony. Remember, their first settlers were employees. You get a share of the money we find, the wealth we make, but it's like getting a paycheck. Well, after a couple of years, that system doesn't work anymore. Nobody's making any money. They're not finding any gold. So what the Virginia Company does is they start giving away the land that they've been able to get from the natives. They start giving colonists that come 100 acres if you're already there. We'll give you 50 for any new immigrants to our colony. So if you're a poor farmer in England and have no prospects for buying land, this is a place where they're literally giving away land. Your only challenge is, how do you get there? During this period in the early 17th century, ocean voyages are expensive, right? Sort of like going on a cruise line today, only it's not nice conditions like they are, even though there are some issues with cruise ships today. Like a cruise ship today, your chances of getting sick on that ship, pretty high. You're not going to have the best supplies. You're not going to have the best food. You're going to be in close contact with a lot of people. It's a pretty smelly, disgusting environment. Lots of germs. So it is a dangerous thing just to journey on these ships, and it's expensive to boot. So you're going to have to figure out how to get here to take advantage of this free land that the Virginia Company is giving away. But the fact that this colony stays alive, that people keep showing up, tells us that there is interest in this, right? People are willing to do it, and they do. By the thousands, they show up to Jamestown and eventually other English colonies to take advantage of the land that is available there. They're not going to find gold and silver, but land ownership is considered wealth in and of itself amongst most English people. The more land you own, the richer they are in their kind of world, if you will, the way they see things. So while land is a big draw, what would you do with it, right? Well, what's really going to get you to risk your life? Because you really are risking your life, both on the voyage and once you get to this colony. What's going to get you to go there? Well, that brings us to a video that I think you should watch. Again, it's in our Chapter 2 online reader, the online resources page. It is the Jamestown video. Watch it. It's only about 8 or 10 minutes long, and it really does kind of explain the draw, the powers that are involved here in kind of pushing people to go to England. So I'm going to pause for a second here and give you a chance to go look at that video and then come back. All right. So now you should have watched that video. You should have an idea of kind of what's happening here, and especially the impact that one particular person is going to have on all of this. His name is John Rolfe. He shows up about a year after John Smith. So two different Johns here. John Rolfe is one guy, John Smith's another. So John Smith is a guy that helps kind of save the colony in its early days and finds a way to negotiate with the natives. John Rolfe is just one of these people that shows up when things are at their absolute worst. He's one of the first shiploads of colonists to show up. So the colony's only got about, well, when he shows up, I think there's only 30 people left alive in Jamestown. But he shows up with another 100, 150 or so colonists, and they try to keep the place going. Because, of course, as in the video, he brings something that changes everything. You now have something to do with that land the colony's giving away. And that, of course, is grow tobacco. And John Rolfe is important for another thing. Not only does he introduce tobacco, which he finds grows really, really well. Tobacco is a plant, that you obviously make cigarettes and cigars from. It's native to the Caribbean. Native Americans have been using it, right? Well, John Rolfe gets hold of some of this somehow and brings it to Virginia and finds out it loves Virginia. Tobacco grows great there, and it comes out great. It makes great cigarettes and great pipe tobacco. And Europeans love tobacco at this time. They're smoking it everywhere, men and women. And then John Rolfe not only introduces tobacco, which becomes a very lucrative crop. His first crop that he grows in 1610 makes him the equivalent of a millionaire today. And of course, all he wants to do is grow more of it. And when he starts getting rich doing it, so does everybody else. They want to do the same thing. Now, one of the ways that Rolfe is able to get the land and kind of make sure that this is secure, right, so he can pass something on to his children, is he marries a woman that's around the settlement. Her name is Pocahontas. So this is where Pocahontas comes in. Remember what I was telling you, in 1607, Pocahontas is probably around 12 years old. Well, 7 years later, she's a young woman now. Rolfe's in his late 20s. Pocahontas is probably in her late teens, early 20s. They meet, whether it's a marriage of love or a marriage of convenience or political alliances, we don't know. But basically, her father, Chief Powhatan, encourages her to marry John Rolfe, and their marriage kind of brings some stability and peace between the natives and the English settlers. She's kind of the go-between. Their family is the go-between between these two groups. Now, one of the things I want you to be aware of, though, is that this is one of the only times you're going to hear about an English man marrying a native woman. And it doesn't mean it doesn't happen, but this is one of the few times where it's actually an important marriage. It's usually frontiersmen on the edge of these English colonies that marries a native woman. For the most part, in these English colonies, English men marry English women, and that is it. Pocahontas, of course, is going to be forced to learn English, dress English, act English, so she really has to give up her native heritage. But in 1616, Rolfe, who's now becoming fabulously wealthy and very popular, decides he's going to bring his wife and his young son to England on a promotional tour to raise more money so he can buy more land and grow even more tobacco. And on that tour, they meet all the nobles of England, including the king himself, King James I. And of course, when you take a native woman around all these Europeans, nothing good is going to happen. Pocahontas gets sick and she dies. Rolfe and Pocahontas' son gets sick and has to be left in England in the care of John Rolfe's family. He comes back to the colony of Jamestown, the Virginia colony, and starts trying to get his tobacco empire into some semblance of shape and grow it. And then after a few years, he gets sick and dies as well. His son is going to inherit all of this from his father. But it's this relative peace that comes between the natives and the English through the marriage of Pocahontas and John Rolfe that allows a lot of this expansion, allows the Virginia Company to negotiate treaties and get more land and give it to their immigrant settlers, and drives a lot of the growth of this colony. John Rolfe gives you a reason to risk your life. If you can get here, get some of that land, start growing some tobacco, you might get rich. So that happens pretty quickly, right? Remember, originally they came looking for gold, but they don't actually find gold in the rivers or in the land. They end up growing it, so to speak, right? Tobacco becomes their main crop. Now, it doesn't mean that they're not going to grow food. They will. They're going to trade and all kinds of other things. But for the most part, these English settlers are going to grow as much tobacco as they possibly can because it makes them money. A few years after Rolfe dies, they're harvesting about 2,500 tons a year, right, out of these colonies. By 1624, it's hundreds of thousands of pounds. By the 1630s, it's in the millions. So these guys, when they come over, as these colonies grow and as other colonies start popping up, they grow a lot of tobacco, which means, well, if you've ever taken an economics class, we know supply and demand, that matters. So as they're increasing the supply, the demand's kind of remaining the same. So that means that the value of what they're growing is going down, 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 down. So if you're somebody like John Rolfe and you're used to getting a lot of money out of this, the only way you can actually keep your income level up as the thing you grow becomes less valuable is to grow more of it. That's what's happening here. By the 1660s, they're growing so much tobacco that tobacco is actually relatively cheap, but it can still make you some money, and it grows really well there in those southern English colonies. So pretty quickly, what you find out is if you're going to grow a lot of tobacco, you need a couple of things. One of those is land. Okay, you're getting that from the natives one way or another. You either go to war with them or you make deals with them, but you can get the land. The next thing you need, of course, is labor. As your farms get bigger, as you grow more and more of this crop, you need more land. You need more labor to work that land. So where does this labor come from? Well, at first, the English do what just about everybody else does. They try to enslave the natives, but again, that doesn't really work for them. The natives know the land, they can get away, and second of all, they often die when they're around Europeans for an extended period of time. So that doesn't work as a reliable source of labor for you. It can work in the short term, but it's not a long-term answer. So instead, they turn to something else. And this something else is here on display on this screen. This is actually part of one of our extra credit activities here for this class, where we compare people going to the Virginia colony to people going to the Massachusetts Bay colony. So I'll give you a little bit of a heads up here as to how to kind of do this extra credit opportunity if you're interested. This is actually a list of people that are heading to Virginia in 1635. And what is on these ships' passenger lists is they're going to tell you everything they know about these people in general. They're going to give you their names, they're going to tell you their ages, and if they have a trade, if they have a job skill, they're going to list that. And then they're also going to put these people together and list their names in family units. So take a look at this list of people. See what you notice here. Does anything jump out on at the screen here, right? You can also open this document up out of the extra credit assignment. You can find it there. But take a look at all these names and see if you notice any particular patterns. Again, You're looking at their names, their ages, do they have any job skills listed, and then are they grouped in families? So I'll give you a minute to kind of look this over. All right, you should have been able to stop the video, kind of go through this a little bit. Let's break this down. First thing that should leap out at us, most of the people coming here, not all, but most of the people coming here are relatively young. So think about what that means. The people that are coming to Virginia to take advantage of this land that's being given away, to try and become tobacco farmers, are very young people. They're people that have no real opportunities in England to gain land, to have viable employment that way. So to them, this makes the most sense. Even though there's an 80% chance they're going to die, if they don't, they'll have something here in the colonies that they would never have back home in England, land and wealth. So they're showing up here. What's something else that popped out at you besides their being young? Well, one of the things we should have noticed is about 70% of them, maybe 80% of them are men. So think about a society that's going to be dominated by young men. Because remember, the English aren't going to marry with the Native Americans. So there's a bunch of young English guys running around in this colony, competing with each other for land, competing with each other to grow tobacco. That's only going to lead to really messy environment, right? Because there's very few women there to kind of mitigate things, to kind of make men kind of check their egos, check their violence, right? In a very real way, the Virginia colony is going to be almost like the Wild West, so to speak. People are going to have problems with each other. They're going to settle them right there. They don't want to wait 3 months to get word from England as to who's got land title to something. They're going to settle it amongst themselves. They don't have time to wait for this stuff. Another thing we should notice here, besides the lack of women, is the fact that because they're young and they don't have a lot of job skills, well, how are people with no money and no job skills getting to these colonies? Well, they have to become what are called indentured servants. Most of the people on this list, virtually all of them, have signed a contract saying, I'll work for somebody, usually between the period of 4 and 7 years, to pay for my voyage over. So essentially, you've sold your labor for years. Now, you're not a slave because you're still human, you still have certain rights. But while you're indentured, while you're working for somebody, whoever holds that contract, and contracts can be sold to other people, you have to do whatever the boss says. And they can say, no, you can't get married. No, you can't do this. No, you can't do that. They can punish you however you want. So it will feel a lot like slavery sometimes, but you know there's an end to it. There's a way out. And at the end of this contract, you get your land, you get set up, your former owner has to help you out. So there is some give and take here. Theoretically, it doesn't always work out that way, but theoretically, that's the way it's supposed to work. So that's kind of how things are for men. One thing I want to point out is, what is it like if you're a woman, though? If you're one of these few English women that shows up coming off this ship, if you're Joan Job or Anne Nash, one of these young women, or maybe even, I know it's a strange name, but Susan Death, right? If you're one of these women walking off this ship, what if you were able to get here without a contract? What happens? Even if you are under contract, you're one of these indentured servants. The minute you get here in a world where 70% of the population is male, these women are going to be asked, do you want to get married? Do you want to have kids, right? Especially if you're young, healthy. Most of these men are going to say, I need a wife so I can pass all this on to somebody else. So you actually, if you're a woman here in this society, things are going to work different for you here than they ever would have back home in England. While a lot of these men are trying to build up wealth, trying to gain land, grow tobacco, the women get to choose who they want to marry. They're going to be asked by 3 or 4 guys, will you marry me? They get to choose, something they don't get to do back home in England. Back home in England, men choose, right? The fathers, the leader, the patriarch of the family, whoever's in charge, is going to decide who their daughters marry, who they're allowed to go with. Here, women are going to have a lot more options. And when their husbands die, they get to do something that they never get to do back home in England. They get to inherit the family wealth. Back home in England, most of the time, when a man dies, His estate, whatever holdings he has, goes on to the next male heir, a son, a cousin, a nephew, whatever it might be. If there's nobody left, then it goes to the woman. Well, think about what's happening here in Virginia. If you're this guy, John Carter, and you've made it here to England, or to Jamestown from England, and you've established yourself, you've created a little farm for yourself. You want to get married because you're getting older and you want to have a kid before you die. So you marry one of these young women coming off the ship. You buy her contract and say, okay, we're going to get married, and then you don't have to be an indentured servant anymore. When he dies, she's going to inherit that land, and then there's going to be somebody else coming along saying, will you marry me? And if that husband dies, now she doesn't have just a little bit of land, she's got a bigger holding, and it grows and it grows and it grows. That's a phenomenon called the first families of Virginia. A lot of the important original settlers married into each other and created huge estates. That's where you get people like George Washington. This actually happened with his family. His grandfather, John Washington, came over and was a rogue, really, right? His grandfather was a guy that ran away from his indentured contract. He ran away to the neighboring colony of Maryland, found a widow, married her, got control of her estate. She died. He married another widow, right? And he put together a little estate. And then he sold that land off, and his son, Augustine Washington, took that land and parlayed it into more land, growing more and more tobacco, until when Augustine dies, George Washington's father, when George Washington's about 12 years old, his father dies. His father has something like 12 different farms. He can even give his youngest son, George, his very own farm at the age of 12 that has about 20 enslaved people working on it to make that thing go, because it's going to be George's job to take care of his mom. So this system does work. It's pretty awful. It is pretty harsh, but it does work, and it is creating wealth, and it is creating a reason to go here to these colonies. So kind of keep that in mind when you're looking at that activity. And we'll kind of do this again when we get to the New England colonies and kind of contrast them a little bit with what's going on here in Virginia. But regardless, these indentured servants absolutely are the backbone of the labor force for this colony. They're making things happen. And we can kind of see that this is the better choice for the English here, because there is another option. The French, the Spanish, the Dutch, they're all using enslaved labor right now, especially in the Caribbean. Heck, even the English, who now have islands in the Caribbean under their control, are using enslaved Africans to grow sugarcane. That option is presented to Jamestown, the Virginia colony, in 1619. A Dutch ship, or maybe a Portuguese ship, we're not entirely sure which it was, shows up at this colony in 1619 with a load of probably about 24 African slaves and tries to sell them. In the end, they sell maybe a dozen. So think about that, right? This colony doesn't need enslaved labor. Why not? Why aren't they doing what everybody else is doing? Well, the fact of the matter is, it doesn't make economic sense. When you purchase an enslaved person, you have to pay the full value up front. When you buy an indentured servant, you're just paying the contract, which is a very small portion of what an enslaved person costs. So indentured servants are cheaper. You can get more of them. And when you get down to it, they're both just as likely to die. Africans and Europeans are all exposed to the same diseases. They're going to die at the same rates to these diseases. So the chances of a slave living long enough to pay you back as its owner the value of the cost of purchase is pretty slim. It makes more sense to do indentured servants. Yeah, the indentured servant will run away. Yes, the indentured servant will die. But in the end, they're pretty cheap to replace. There's always more of them coming. As I showed you earlier, by the thousands they're showing up. So this is a kind of an interesting start. On the flip side of this, however, they are purchasing some, right? This idea of racial slavery has already been introduced within a decade of the Jamestown colony's survival, right? Of being established and getting their foothold. The English are already starting to use some African slavery, right? They're using enslaved people on their farms in the English Empire. So it's a curious mix of things that are going on here in the Jamestown colony and the Virginia colony, and we'll try to explain how this shift takes place away from indentured servants and more towards enslaved Africans as the labor source for this colony as we move along here. Now, one of the things we kind of have to keep in mind, one of the reasons that indentured servants make a lot of sense is because while they may not like being controlled or being told what to do, most English people don't. One thing we can say is they're used to kind of having the landed person in charge, right? If you own land, again, that means wealth and power and status. So if you are an indentured servant, you kind of know how the system works and you understand you have to kind of pay attention to these people. So it kind of works for them. It makes sense to the English settlers in Virginia and Maryland and North Carolina and other places. So even though they're giving up a lot of rights, things like being able to marry whoever they want, whenever they want, or they can't stop their being transferred over to another owner while they're under contract, they definitely do understand that this ends. That in the end, indentured servants, most of them will run away or die, but a few of them will work off those contracts. A few of them will see them to the end. So this system does work for the English pretty well, at least for the first few generations of these colonies. Another curious thing that happens here in this colony is something that will become very important down the road. In 1619, the same year that slavery is introduced to the Jamestown colony or the Virginia colony, something else is instituted as well. The Virginia company is basically going out of business. And it's tired of trying to run this very chaotic little colony that isn't really paying it back a whole lot for the investments that it's put into it. So what they do is they create an assembly to actually run the day-to-day affairs of the colony. Now, the Virginia company back home in London still ostensibly controls this colony, is still the final arbitrator. They send a governor, somebody that's supposed to represent the owners, the investors of the company, to this colony to kind of protect their interests. But this assembly, made up of the largest landowners in the colony, actually gets to pass a lot of the day-to-day laws. How they deal with problems, who's going to be a judge to settle legal disputes. They're going to actually get to handle all of those issues. And what ends up happening is they're going to vote, they're going to allow the colonists themselves, those that aren't indentured servants, those people that own land, to actually choose who's going to be in this assembly. This is kind of what we would call representative democracy or self-government. And it starts the same year that slavery begins in this colony. So it's kind of this continuing back and forth juxtaposition, if you will, of slavery and freedom in the English colonies and eventually the United States. That a country that talks a lot about freedom can also deny freedom to a large number of people. Well, that's happening from the very beginning. There's a lot of indentured servants. Now there's enslaved Africans that are denied their freedom, while other people, especially landowners, get to exercise more freedom than they ever have before. Kind of a curious thing if you stop and think about it. Another big change that happens for this colony, of the Virginia colony, is the fact that while natives were absolutely essential for keeping this colony going in the very beginning, the constant pressure of new Europeans showing up, more English settlers coming in, has really caused the two groups to see each other as enemies by this point. By 1622, just about 3-4 years after Pocahontas' death in Europe, in England, the natives, the Powhatan people, have decided they just can't handle this anymore. Pocahontas' father, Powhatan, has died of old age. His younger brother has taken over, and his younger brother has been saying since the beginning, we can't let these people stay here. It's going to be a disaster for us. Well, when he gets to take over the tribe in 1622, he decides we have to stand now or else these people are going to take over everything. They've already pushed us out of a lot of our land, and there are just more of them showing up all the time. So in 1622, essentially the Powhatan people and the Jamestown settlers, or the Virginia colony, because it's not just Jamestown anymore, there's several little settlements in the area, they go to war. Within the first year of the war, about a quarter of the European population, about a quarter of the English settlers are killed. Most of them at what the English call the Jamestown Massacre. The natives attack them kind of like at dinner time one day and kill off a lot of the population of Jamestown. The colonists respond to this attack by going out and just wiping out native villages. Even if they weren't natives that are part of the Powhatan tribe, they don't care, they just wipe them out. They just kill everybody in the village and then take all their food so that anybody that was escaped or survived will now starve to death. So this becomes just a brutal war, and it kind of comes back on and off over the next 20 years. By 1644, that group of people that we call the Powhatans are totally wiped out. There's some remnants of them still to this day on their ancestral lands. But for the most part, by 1644, the English have won and they've taken control. So how is it possible, right? The English suffer some horrific losses in the beginning. The natives are doing pretty well. What happens here to make it so one-sided? Well, the fact is that during this 20-year struggle, diseases are decimating the native populations, not all at once, but it's getting harder and harder to find soldiers to fight if you're a native. And even though you do kill a lot of these English settlers, there's more showing up all the time. They just keep coming. And that weighs on the natives, right? They deal with wave after wave of English settlers, and they eventually just break and the English take over. Eventually, groups like the Pamunkey, right? The Pamunkey, they're one of the tribes that made up the Powhatan Nation. Now they're going to be forced by 1644 to live on kind of a small piece of land, kind of swampy land along the James River. So the roles have kind of completely reversed here. By the 1640s, the English have really decimated, taken over the Powhatan Nation's tribal lands, and now are the ones that get to kind of control things. They can grow all the tobacco they want, and the natives are kind of forced to live on the worst land and just try and eke out a survival. And they're still there to this day, living on these lands that were forced on them on a reservation in 1644. It's still a big controversy in Virginia to this day. Now, one of the things we do want to kind of take a look at is the fact that while there's external conflict between the English and the natives, there's also some internal conflict between the English and the English. All right, and this shows up in a thing called Bacon's Rebellion. About 7 decades into this, the Virginia colony is no longer a group of investors, right? The Virginia Company goes out of business in 1624. The colony of Virginia is now a pretty big colony with a lot of people, grows a lot of tobacco. A lot of indentured servants are going there. And a lot of people see it as a place for opportunity. One of them is a person by the name of Nathaniel Bacon. He's the young son of an English noble. He has an education, he's used to having nice things, but he's also the youngest son of his father, which means he's going to inherit nothing when his father dies, or very little. He won't be able to kind of keep the lifestyle he's grown accustomed to. So he decides, under the advice of his sister, to come to Virginia and try and get land and grow tobacco and become wealthy that way. Kind of makes sense. He has some ins. Again, his sister is actually married to the governor of Virginia, the guy that represents the colony not for the company anymore, but now for the English king. So Nathaniel Bacon decides to take a risk. He shows up to the Virginia colony, makes friends with the governor, uses his sister's connection to start getting loans from people so he can start getting land. But what he quickly finds out is all the good land's taken. He's forced to go to the edge of the colony, take land basically from the natives, the next tribe and the next tribe, and try to grow tobacco there. What he finds out is when you're pushed to the edge of the colony like that, you don't get a lot out of it. You go and take the land from the natives, and of course the natives get upset and they attack you back for attacking them. Well, Nathaniel Bacon and a lot of other poor farmers on the edge of this colony, most of them runaway indentured servants, some runaway native or enslaved Africans, they ask for help from the government, from the governor of the colony of Virginia. They say, look, we're under attack from the natives. Come and help us. And the governor, Nathaniel Bacon's own brother-in-law, says, no, I'm not going to do that. You're on your own. Well, Bacon and his men, these fellow farmers on the frontier, get so upset with this that they decide, yeah, we're going to deal with the natives, but first we're going to go deal with all these rich farmers in the middle of the colony who are benefiting from everything and not giving anything to us. He leads a rebellion. And in 1676, this actually happens. Nathaniel Bacon and a group of poor farmers say, look, we're tired of being taxed and not being represented in the legislature. We're tired of the government, the people in the government looking out for their own interests, passing all kinds of laws on us that we can't respond to, that take our land away from us, from not protecting us, which is the job of a government in the first place. For all those reasons, we're rebelling against this government. Now, important to kind of keep in mind here, Nathaniel Bacon is not rebelling against the King of England. He's actually rebelling against his brother-in-law, William Berkeley. And that's how, again, how you say his name. I know it's spelled Berkeley, but you pronounce it Barclay. And Nathaniel Bacon says, look, I'm coming to the government here in Jamestown to get a commission to raise an army to wipe out the natives so we can get land. And if you're not going to help us, well, then you are the problem and we're going to deal with you. And he leads a rebellion against the wealthy landowners that dominate this House of Burgesses, this assembly that runs the colony. Nathaniel Bacon and his men actually win this rebellion. They drive off the wealthy landowners who are friends with Berkeley and have been taking care of themselves at the expense of everybody else in the colony. And Nathaniel Bacon takes control. And then, because he hasn't been there a long time, he gets sick, and that's right, you know it, he dies. And when he dies, his rebellion dies with him. Because he's educated, because he's wealthy, he has connections, he was kind of the de facto leader of this rebellion. It's why it's named after him. And when he dies, the rebellion falls apart. The wealthy come back, and they take control. Now, they do understand that they have to ease up a little bit, that they have to kind of take care of the poor farmers better than they have up to this point. But it also kind of brings something up to these guys, these wealthy landowners. There are more of these indentured servants showing up all the time. This problem is just going to get worse as they want more and more land and honestly start competing against you, a wealthy landowner, in selling tobacco. Tobacco that's becoming less valuable all the time. So this colony starts changing its focus when it comes to labor. Up to this point, for the past 70 years or so, this colony has relied on white indentured servants to grow tobacco. Suddenly, they're going to shift. And what I'm showing you here on top of this slide is a picture from one of the English colonies in the Caribbean. Because there, they don't use indentured servants. No English person is running off to the Caribbean to work in the sugarcane fields. It's hard work, and you're likely to die within 7 years. And you get nothing out of it if you do. They're going to the colonies like Virginia and Maryland because they give away land once you're done with your contract. That's the way the system's been working for about 70 years. But Bacon's Rebellion tells a lot of these rich landowners, look, you need labor to grow your crops, but you can't rely on these white indentured servants. They're going to turn into the competition. What's a better way to do this? Bring in enslaved Africans like we're using in the Caribbean and make them do the labor. Because after all, they're not English. They don't have the same rights. Are not subject to the same laws. You can treat them differently. And look at what happens. From Bacon's Rebellion in 1676, this is a complete flip, right? When Bacon is leading his rebellion, virtually everybody that was working in farms in Virginia was white. By 1690, about 20 years after his rebellion, almost everybody working in tobacco fields is black, enslaved peoples from Africa. Now, Bacon's Rebellion isn't the only reason this is happening. Indentured servants have more options now. The beginnings of the Industrial Revolution are starting to happen in England, so there's more opportunities for jobs in England than there ever were before. The different ways to support yourself. You don't just have to own land and grow food anymore. So there are a lot of things going on here that explain this shift. But Bacon's Rebellion and the idea that you could use one group of people as a perpetual source of labor is definitely a part of all of that rebellion's legacy that we have to kind of keep in mind. Once again, a lot of white people are getting a lot of freedom and economic opportunity out of this, and a lot of black people are the ones that are actually having to kind of do the work to make that possible. Starts really in a big scale here with Bacon's Rebellion. Which brings us to one of our sources, and it's actually part of our discussion board for this particular chapter, right? One of the things we want to kind of take a look at are some questions that we should have when we look at these laws that are starting to be passed by this assembly, right? This colonial assembly, the House of Burgesses for the colony of Virginia. They start writing a bunch of laws as the enslaved population grows, determining who can be a slave, who can't be a slave, and how do you treat slaves. So you want to take a look at that document and kind of be able to answer these questions. They'll help you with that discussion board, right? First thing you want to understand is who can be enslaved. Could you enslave a white indentured servant from England? Could you make them a slave? Well, the answer is no, you actually can't. The most you can do is make them an indentured servant, and the minute they either run away or get their freedom by paying off the contract, that's it. They're just like a normal citizen again. Can you enslave Native Americans? The answer is yes, but there's actually an out for them. If you look in those laws, they say, look, if you're a Native American, you learn English, and you become a Christian, we're going to give you your freedom. So if you're a Native American and you're caught in this, there's an out for you. Who is there not an out for? Enslaved Africans. They're forced into this, and what is really powerful about it is it becomes generational. One of those laws that is incredibly important is that the status of a person will be determined by the condition of their mother. What they mean by that is, how do you know if somebody's free or a slave? What was their mom? If their mom was free, they're free. If their mother was a slave, then they're a slave. That is totally new, right? That has never been the way most of the world has looked at slavery. You could be enslaved, but if you had a child, your child was born initially free. And now there were exceptions to that in different parts of history, human history. But for the most part, that's kind of how European and African slavery worked. But the English are going to change things here, because again, they want to control this population for as long as they possibly can. And by making it generational, it makes it easier to control this population over and over again, right? So kind of look at some of these laws. You can kind of see this evolution in slavery in these laws. Look at the punishments that happen in the early years, the first years of these slave codes, and look at what happens at the end. By the 1690s, early 1700s, as the slave population is growing and growing, look at how much control you, a white owner, have over this group of people. What can you do to them that you couldn't do to a white person by the 1690s? Take a look at all of that. I think that'll help you kind of answer these questions for the discussion board. So kind of keep in mind that these laws are becoming more detailed. They're giving more power all the time. That's really what it's all about. These slave codes make slave owners absolutely dictators, right? It means they have total control in a lot of ways. And one of the biggest changes is the fact that children are now subject to becoming slaves themselves. You don't even have to go out and keep purchasing slaves. You can just make your slaves have kids, and then those kids are now your slaves. That is something monstrous that had never really been done before, but it's now becoming accepted in most European societies and their empires in the New World, but definitely here in the English Empire. Another thing I kind of want to close with here is the fact that I've been talking a lot about Virginia, but because it's a template, right? It's kind of the example that a lot of other colonies are going to follow, but it's by far and away not the only colony. You have Virginia founded in 1607 with the Jamestown colony. Then you have Maryland to the north of it, established in the 1630s as a refuge for English Catholics, but eventually it just becomes full of runaway indentured servants from Virginia. You also have the Carolinas that are created in the 1660s, massive land grant from the English king to people he owes a lot of money to. Eventually that colony of Carolina splits up into South Carolina and North Carolina. And eventually, by the 1730s, a new colony called Georgia, as kind of a buffer zone between the Spanish and the English, is created then at that time. And what we have to say is, while all these colonies are a little different, they essentially run the same way. Get here to these colonies, buy some land, get hold of land, and start growing some kind of cash crop, usually tobacco. But maybe in South Carolina, it's rice. Maybe in Georgia, it's rice or indigo, right? A dye type of plant. So there's a way forward here, right? There's a reason to come here. Land is cheap. They're literally giving it away in places like Maryland and Virginia and even North Carolina. You just have to get there and settle it. So what happens is a lot of these early colonies are very agricultural based. And the more land, of course, you have, the more labor you need, but also potentially the more wealth you can create. What we're seeing is the beginnings of the plantation system that come to dominate the American South by the 19th century. It's already started in Virginia, and now it's spreading out to all these other colonies as well. That's the model going forward. What we're going to notice is it's not going to be like that in every English colony. There are going to be differences. Just like the different Europeans have different types of empires, the English are going to have different types of colonies. They're going to have different focuses, if you will, right? Okay, so a couple conclusions here. We got through it. We made it all the way through, right? First thing to kind of keep in mind, these English colonies are not guaranteed to succeed. Roanoke was a disaster. Jamestown was a disaster in the beginning, barely survived. The Native Americans aren't just giving up and walking away. They do fight, like the Powhatan fight a 20-year war to try and hold on to their lands. But in the end, the differences in technology, the diseases that are hitting both populations are just more devastating to the natives than they are the English. And the fact is the English can replace their losses faster than the natives can. Another thing to kind of keep in mind is that the English aren't particularly well planned colonies, right? They're kind of ad hoc. They just kind of go along with whatever works at the moment, which leads a lot of times to this high mortality rate, especially in the southern colonies. They're warmer, they're wetter, there are more insects, so they die a lot faster in the southern colonies. Going to be different than what happens in the northern colonies that we're going to talk about next time. But in the end, these southern English colonies, right, what will become the American South, they're not going to be successful until they figure out two things. First of all, what can you grow to make you money? Tobacco solves that problem. And then who's going to do the work to make that happen? Starts out with indentured servants, but because of Bacon's Rebellion, you can't trust that group anymore. You don't want more of those people competing with you, so you turn to African slaves. Enslaved peoples become the main workforce for this society. They become a crucial part of the wealth building that's taking place in these colonies. All right, that's where we're going to leave it this time, and I'll talk to you in our next lecture.